Okay, hopefully that gets it done. Um, all right, so no questions about the assignment? Feel good about where we are? All right. Last week was a very, very quick overview of the different forms of assessment, obviously. And as an educator, you are going to see all of those different forms. It's not going to take very long. Within your first couple of months, you will right away experience all six of those different forms that we talked about. So luckily, it's not going to be a situation where you're going to have to wait years and years and years and then think, oh wait, I remember kind of learning something about that way back when. Every single one of those will be right at the forefront. Special education assessment is obviously a little bit more contingent on you having special education students in your class. That being said, understanding the framework for assessment is also the same basic knowledge that you have to have for understanding the framework for special education assessment. Okay. How many of you know that you want to work with special education students in any capacity, either inclusion, SPED, self-contained? Anyone? Couple? All right, good. How many of you think you will go your entire teaching career without teaching special education students? Everyone put your hands down right now. Right? Exactly. Yeah.
I was just confused by the first question.
No.
Okay,
So
so I thought you were asking if we intended to specifically work
yes.
with special, okay.
Yeah. So question one, do you want to be a special education teacher? Question two, do you think that if you don't want to be a special education teacher, that you are never going to work with special education students? And very obviously at this point, the answer to that second one is you don't really have a choice, right? There are special education students in just about every classroom. Every teacher at this point is expected to have some interaction with special education students, whether or not you are the primary special education teacher, or you are on the IEP, or you are just the second teacher in a classroom. Regardless, you will interact, you will teach, you will be working with special education students at some point, which means you are obviously going to have to make educational decisions about their progress. You are most likely going to have to assess their progress. They are going to be on your rosters and part of your roles. So I'm glad over time, over the years that I've been here, the expectation and the understanding that every teacher is going to work with special education students has changed. And the fact that I can stand up here now in front of you guys and you all come in knowing that that is going to be the case is great. All right. There is a difference, both practically, functionally, logistically, all at every level, between a special education student in a self-contained classroom and a special education student in a general education classroom. All right. Where some teachers run into trouble, where many teachers run into trouble, is when you are at schools where your principal has made a decision that we are going to do all of one or all of another. So we are going to say every special education student is going to be in a self-contained classroom. That is illegal. It still happens, but it's very, very rare. And again, it is illegal. What is much more common is the other side, which is not illegal, but I think much more problematic, which is every special education student is going to be in an inclusion classroom. All right. I am all for inclusion. I was an inclusion teacher. I love inclusion. I love what you can do with special education students in the inclusion classroom. It is not appropriate for every single student. And that really shows up in assessment. We talked about the kind of the why of assessment. We talked about the law. We talked about progress monitoring. We talked about knowing where students are and making decisions. there are a number of special education students where the standard approach is not the appropriate approach. I had many of you in EDUC 392, either last semester or last summer. We talked about free and appropriate education, FAPE, in the least restrictive environment, LRE. Those are two concepts that have to win the day, no matter what. And that really, really ends up showing up in assessment, okay? Does anyone have experience in, particularly in an inclusion classroom with special education students? Anyone seen that for a little bit? What? Okay. So daycare is a little bit different, obviously, because you're not assessing a whole heck of a lot. But where you do kind of evaluate students, even in a daycare, whether it's play skills or otherwise, how do you work with those special education students? What is done the same? What's done differently?
They're getting the same exact like care, but like with the ones in special education, we usually like work more closely to them. Like we like will spend more one-on-one time with them.
Okay, good. So you're providing a little bit more individualized instruction, which is overall good. Excellent. So there we go. So let's start off by looking at the idea that starts to separate special education students from general education students when it comes to assessment. First thing that's important to know is not every special education student requires an assessment that is inherently, in some way, shape, or form, special education. There are absolutely SPED students who are capable of, and where it is appropriate for them to take general education assessments without any support. All right. There are different tiers of special education assessment. You have IEP students, you have Section 504 students, some Section 504 students do fall into special education, some do not. So there's lots of gray area there. I'm not talking about the Section 504 students, and if you don't know what I'm talking about when I say Section 504, we can talk about it later. It's not hugely important right now. But I'm not talking about the students that are of neurotypical across the board cognitively, but have a lisp, let's say, or a vision impairment to the degree that it can still be corrected with glasses. All right, those are two levels of student or classes of student that would fall under Section 504, but we wouldn't expect to need massive accommodations for them. Massive being non-technical term, right? There are, so excluding them from this conversation, all right, we have a number of students who have diagnosed disabilities, who need support, but who have had quality enough support and are in a place where they can take regular assessments without support. Why is that important? Why is it important for us to understand that there is that level of student that can succeed in that way?
Is it because you can assess them the same way you would do their education?
Yeah, and I'm thinking more philosophically, as practically, that is absolutely true. Why is that important, though?
You don't want to limit them to it.
And keep going.
Like,
Yeah.
don't want to hold them back from like the full potential because it's just like.
Good. we need to know, full potential is kind of like the word that I'm looking for there. We need to start from a point of understanding that just because they're special education students does not mean that they require special education. It is possible to overcome the characteristics of a disability that impact education. That doesn't mean they lose their diagnosis. That doesn't mean that they aren't special education. But we have to understand that there is a point where support is no longer needed. All right? Do you have a question?
I was just gonna say, so do you think there's a point in which special education can limit special ed students?
Yeah, and we'll talk about that. Absolutely, I do. Yeah, really good point. So for those students, so we have tier one. Tier one is not a good label because tier one means something. We have group one of special education students who can succeed in regular ed assessment without support. Awesome. We have group two, which is special education students that can succeed in regular education assessment with support. All right, so that's one box. At that point, we have a line. All right. And that line starts to move into what we call alternative assessment. Alternative assessment is the next group down and below, where we start to recognize that there are students who do not contact the curriculum in the same way as their peers. All right. I just switched the language that I was using. I was talking about assessments, and now here, as I'm talking about alternative assessment, I use the word curriculum. All right. Why is that important? Before we were talking about succeeding on the assessment, but as soon as we move to alternative assessment, it's talking about students who are not able to contact the curriculum. Yeah.
Does that mean that standard assessments would no longer be really effective engaging them?
Yes, but why?
Is it because they can't grasp the general curriculum?
Yes. All right. What's important to understand here is we're not talking about assessment for the sake of assessment. We are talking about assessment as a measure of the curriculum. If you have students that can contact the curriculum, but cannot succeed in an assessment environment, that doesn't mean that they shouldn't be exposed to those assessments. We need to find ways to accommodate. All right. Alternative assessment is for students who are not learning through the curriculum that the general education students are using. There's a big difference between not being successful in a testing environment and not learning on a day-to-day basis. What this allows for is this gives some recognition that lost my train of thought. This gives some recognition that the curriculum is the more important measure. Progress through the curriculum is the more important measure than the standalone assessment. Okay? Does that make sense? When we have to change the curriculum, that's when we change the assessment. All right? We'll get into, as we're talking about the assessment in our different subject areas, we'll get into this concept in much more detail. All right. So what is alternative assessment then? Alternative assessment can be any number of things. All right. But they are, when you start to leave the world of tier one curriculum, everything within the education paradigm kind of falls apart. Right? It's really not that there's not this strong cohesion between special education curricula and special education assessments. And it's actually a really, really big problem that we face on a regular basis. Almost every curriculum maker ties their curriculum to standards and objectives, right? Every assessment is going to say the targets here are tied to the state standards. All right, so they're both working towards this common thing. When you take that out, there's really no consensus as to what these children actually need to learn, in what way, and how do they need to demonstrate it. That problem is inherent in the nature of special education, which is highly individualized, right? We are supposed to teach to the needs of the student. We're supposed to work with their individual goals. We're supposed to have basically an individualized curriculum for every single special education student. That's what the IEP is. Contrast that with the 80% of the students in my class that are tier 1 RTI students, plus the 15% of students in my class that are tier 2 RTI students, who are all learning the same thing, basically, right? So I have 95% of my students that are learning the same thing. Then I have my special education students who are each learning something different. So how do I have a uniform assessment for each one of those individual students? Just that sentence doesn't even make sense, right? Uniform assessment for individuals, right? Or based on individuals, right? So it's a really, really challenging goal to provide high quality, consistent assessment based on these unique individualized curriculum. So that's the challenge of alternative assessment and assessment within special education as a whole, all right? So again, really quickly, let's look at the different types of assessment that we had, the same as last week. We have formative and summative, the before, during, and after. We have curriculum-based assessment and curriculum-based measurement. So what the curriculum has taught us versus how the curriculum has succeeded in teaching us concepts. And we have formal and informal assessment. So we have our standardized tests, we have our testing procedures, we have questions, we have moment-to-moment decision-making. So these are the 6 different types of assessment that we have. All of these can be adapted in some way to special education students, and that's what we're going to be focusing on today. So let's kind of go through through each of these in some particular order and look at the different ways that special education assessments are adapted for each of those 6 different categories. So the first category, starting with the least amount of freedom that we have as teachers. These are our summative assessments, our big end of year, end of unit assessments that are going to be kind of less used for decision making and more used for reporting purposes, correct? So the first way to look at these summative assessments, is through the lens of the traditional general education assessment with accommodations. So this is looking at how do we work with this applies to formative as well, but this is looking at how do we look at that group 1 and group 2, the students who do not need support, or the students who can take the general education assessment, but might need some support, all right? The support, the support that we provide are through what we call accommodations and modifications. Accommodations change how we either teach or assess something. Modifications change what we teach or assess. We're going to focus on accommodations here, all right? Generally speaking, there are 3 different types of accommodations or modifications that we can provide. Anyone, they're not these, anyone from 392 want to give a crack at what they are? Ecological, which is where, curricular, which is what we teach, or instructional, which is how we teach. All right, so we can accommodate where, how, or what our instruction entails. And that, for the most part, applies to our assessment as well. We can't really change what we assess, but we can change how we assess it and where we assess it, okay? So some of the different types of accommodations that we can make for special education students in a gen ed environment in particular are timing accommodations, setting accommodations, presentation, and response accommodations, all right? When you are serving on an IEP team, one of the components of the IEP meeting is reviewing the different testing accommodations that are available to the student. And you get this list of like 50 different possible accommodations. And for most IEP programs, you just check off the ones you want. It's really easy. The fact that it's that easy is nice because it's easy and we have plenty of hard things to do in our lives. The fact that it's that easy is a problem because what ends up happening, there usually ends up being 3 or 4 or 5 accommodations that apply to most kids that most teachers just check off, not at random, but without putting any thought into it, all right? So we'll talk about what some of those look like, why they're good, why they're bad, all right? First one, timing accommodations. One of the standard testing accommodations that you will see on almost every single IEP is 1.5 times for testing. So if there's an hour to conduct the test or the assessment, then for your general education population, then your SPED student has 90 minutes. All right, seems straightforward enough. Using that as an example, we have to look at 2 things. One, is it appropriate for the student? And 2, does the way in which their disability hinders their ability to take the test, will that be aided by 1.5 times? If you have a student who has, let's say, a strong level of reading comprehension, but their disability impacts their ability to read at a fluent level, they will be helped by 1.5 times because they will be able to read the material, comprehend it, and answer the questions. That is an appropriate use of 1.5 times on a test. If you have a child who cannot read, and you are giving them 90 minutes instead of 60 minutes to conduct a reading assessment that requires them to read, that extra 30 minutes is not going to be beneficial. If you have a student whose disability leads to tantrum behaviors during testing settings, requiring an extra 30 minutes is going to be horrible, right? You are dooming that child to have to sit there. You are now legally obligated to have the child sit there for an extra 30 minutes or until they finish and tantrum. So in those situations, 1.5 times is not an appropriate accommodation. So you have to think about what the disability is, what the impact on the child's educational behaviors are, and if these accommodations would actually help them. All right, make sense? Okay, so 1.5 times is a very, very, very common testing accommodation that we have. Most of the time it is beneficial. It is not always beneficial. Another reason that 1.5 times is beneficial has to do with some of these other things. Many of the other accommodations just require more time to get through, okay? We'll get that with presentation and response accommodations. Setting accommodations. We can have the child sit in the back of the room. We can have the child sit in a different room. We can have the assessment administered by some other individual in a different room. You will often see special education students go to either a self-contained classroom or a pull-out classroom or a resource classroom in order to do their assessments. Great, totally fine, okay? We can change the, or we can accommodate the presentation of the questions on the assessment. What might be a very simple way of changing how we present assessment material?
Would it be just like reading out the test?
Absolutely. Having the test read aloud, having the questions read aloud. That is another very common accommodation that you would see. What are some other ways that you might change how an assessment is presented?
You mean like maybe do it on a computer?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Type the whole thing up, do it on a computer. Good. What else? So I would put that with back with the setting, but you could, there's an argument there that would go under presentation as well. If you're having someone read the questions aloud, it would make sense that they go to a different room so they don't have to whisper the questions, right? So they can be connected in that way. Good. Having fewer questions. Having only the pertinent information or highlighting the pertinent information, right? There are lots of different ways that you can accommodate or modify the actual test itself, where you still assess the critical information, but maybe you are not requiring as much discrimination or as much reading or comprehension as a typical student. But the core information is still there. Good. What about response accommodations? How might we change an assessment so that our children can respond in different ways? Yeah.
Students can give a spoken response instead of a written response.
Good. Excellent. Excellent.
Like all multiple choice.
Okay, good. Multiple choice. Limiting the type or style of question. Good.
Along with what you said, like if they're telling you, you can have someone write down answers.
Okay, good. So that's a really, really interesting one. That's called a scribe. All right. And that is absolutely one of the accommodations that's on there. Scribes are typically only used in the upper grades because think through the actual logistical challenge of having a scribe. So I am dictating an essay response to you. Let's say a short answer paragraph to you, right? I'm going to their house. What do I have to do? My scribe is typing it out. What do the special education student, have to do?
Tell them.
Which
Presentation.
spelling of the word there? All right. What kind of punctuation are we using? Do we need a hyphen there? And guess what? You, as the scribe, can't ask leading questions. So the special education student has to know that there are different spellings of there, that we need punctuation, that all of these pieces have to be in there, and they have to be able to articulate that. So that is a very high level skill. What I'm trying to get at here is that the balance between accommodating, getting the information you need, and making something easier and or harder all have to be looked at, all right? There are very specific ways that each of these accommodations are are to be implemented, there's not going to be a special education assessment police that are after you if you do something slightly wrong. But the key here is that you have to make sure that you're not answering for the child in any way, shape, or form, that it is the child that is being assessed, and that you are doing what is intended to be done in these procedures. All right.
If you can compromise their learning.
Yeah, or the measurement of their learning, right? Which has all those ramifications that we talked about for assessment in general. All right. So having special education assessment accommodations in a regular education classroom might not be logistically challenging, but it can be a challenge to implement with fidelity, I would say. All right. Then we have on the summative side, the third and fourth group, or the alternative assessment group. Now, with alternative assessment, and we'll get to some of the other pieces in a sec, there are good, do I get to it? Where do I get to it? I may have to just talk for a little bit. There are assessments out there that are either formative or summative in nature, that give you, that are developed for special education students, that give you a good picture of where the student is on specific skills. That's kind of your group 3. Group 4 are for students who really do not contact curriculum in general in a meaningful way. And why that's important is because our curricula are skill-based and standard-based and objective-based. Most importantly, there are concrete goals that we are teaching and therefore assessing. There's a group of students where they are not going to acquire those more traditional educational goals. All right. We do have a population of students that need to be focusing on self-help skills, maybe vocational skills down the line. You can be focusing on toileting. You can be focusing on feeding. You can be focused on leisure and communication and occupying yourself in a meaningful way throughout the day. We have to understand that there is this population that is entitled to a free and appropriate public education that could be in our students that is much more severely disabled. All right. For those students, we still need things to teach them. We still have to be held accountable for those goals, and we still have to figure out ways to assess them. So these are the children who are most individualized for. And for these students, we have what are called portfolio assessments. And when you think of a portfolio assessment, you guys are gonna have to complete one in a couple short years, but what types of subjects do you think of? English, good. Art comes to mind for me, or photography, right? The portfolio is this group of product that has been completed, not at a given, not at like a final point, but throughout the year, put together and assessed as a whole. It's exactly what we're talking about when we talk about special education. So let's say you are working on counting skills, all right, with a more severely disabled student in a self-contained classroom. Your goal is not to, at the end of the year, have them count to 5 or 10 or 20 or 100. Your goal for the portfolio is to turn in a product that demonstrated at some point throughout the year that they were able to, it might be something like make 5 marks on a page. All right, it could be counting, it could be a higher order skill for sure, but it can be more representative of the skill than demonstration, long-term demonstration of the skill. Now, as far as a summative assessment goes, there's challenges to that, right? What long-term information does that really give us? How are we going to make long-term decisions about the student based on this type of assessment? And I'm not sure that there's a great answer out there. There are decent answers. We can always find a way to connect A to B. But when you're talking about portfolio assessments, you're talking about a very small subset of the student population that is going to need a lot of support. All right. Has anyone been in self-contained classes where you have more severely disabled students? Been there before? You have students that are wheelchair bound or who have very low cognitive functioning, and they're still there. They're still active, they're still doing things, they're still participating. You got to teach them something, right? That teaching can be very slow and be very difficult, but that is your job as their teacher, right? And if you are teaching something, then you have to be held accountable to it. And you do that through this assessment process. All right, cool. Any questions there? That's kind of what I talked about. All right, so for summative assessments, our options are, we have 3 options. I went over 2 of them in detail. We have our general education assessments with or without accommodations. We have special education assessments, which I'm going to get into in a minute. And then we have portfolios. So those are the 3 ways that we look at that. Formative SPED assessments. So there's a lot of debate in terms of kind of that group 2, group 3 that we talked about. So you have your general educate, your students who are in the inclusion classroom who need support. You have your students in your special education classroom who are learning things at a pretty good clip, but not commensurate with their peers, right? So they are not on the general education curriculum, but they are learning things at a pretty good rate. So what do we do with these students? How do we assess these students? What has generally come to be accepted in special education is this idea of these skills-based assessments and curriculum. Hello. What do I mean by that? So if you go into the Louisiana State Standards and you look up math 1.2, right? You're going to get something like counts to 100. Completely making that up, all right? But that's going to be in there. Somewhere in there, it's going to say, student will be able to count to 100. Great. Is that an appropriate goal for a special education student? Maybe not necessarily a first grade special education student, but a special education student. Count to 100. Yeah, absolutely. Is it appropriate as one goal? Just on paper, student will be able to count to 100. No. When we talk about special education students, and this is, again, both for curriculum and for assessment, we are almost always talking about more discrete, more refined goals. So what might my count to 100 goals look like? So I'm working towards that same standard, but I'm going to have multiple goals or objectives along the way. counts to 5, counts to 10, counts to 20, identifies the tens, then counts to 100. So I might have 5 separate goals that create the standard. Those are my skills. And I'm going to be measuring each of those skills individually. Hopefully, through my curriculum, that is then going to be either used as my assessment or then be assessed. Where we really run into a challenge is this idea of exposure versus mastery. If I have a student, how do I want to present this? If I have a student in a regular education classroom, typical student, and they are getting a C, have they been exposed to the skill or have they mastered the skill? They've been exposed to the skill, all right? Are we going to have any question about whether or not we move them on? 70%, are you going to move from 2nd grade to 3rd grade? Yeah, absolutely. All right. Special education student, they've learned 70% of a skill. Are we going to move them on to the next skill? What do you guys think? Should we? I'll break it up. Are we going to, and should we?
I feel like it depends on what the skill is.
Okay, good.
Especially in earlier grade levels where the skills they learn will be more important. In later grade levels, the skills get more complex. So even typical students won't be able to fully master them. So it's
No, I like that. I like that. What's the problem with your thought process?
that some students may never be able to master.
I was going to say it's very utopian, right? If we focused, I would argue that if we focused on mastery for everyone at the younger grades, we would have that luxury, right? What's the reality? We can't, we don't have the will to do it. It doesn't happen. And the kids that aren't mastering those bigger concepts at the higher grades, it's often because they're still learning to read. And you get a 6th grader, 7th grader, hopefully not, but definitely is present 8th grade, 9th grader that is still reading on a 1st or 2nd grade level. It's because they were exposed. They never got taught to mastery. I don't even want to say for better or worse. For worse, there are mechanisms in the general education population to continue to move students through. There's a systemic problem for a different day. In special education, I would argue for the better, we typically don't have this concern. At least we don't start off that way. Special education classrooms at the younger grades are very, very good at focusing on teaching to mastery. Sounds great, right? The problem is that the goals, as they are written on their IEP, are so few in number or so weak in their function or structure that we're only getting through 5 or 6 or 8 or 10 goals a year. Whereas a typical student, a general education student, is learning 50 or 100 or 200 goals every year, if we were to break it up equivalently. So even though we are teaching to mastery, and hopefully to a degree that we can build upon those skills, the number of skills that we are learning is so small. I would say that that's because of poorly written IEPs, not because of what most students are capable of doing. But it's incumbent upon us as teachers to move our students along, teach to mastery, and do everything that we can to keep them as close to up to speed as possible. Because what's going to happen? They're going to get a year or 2 years or 3 years behind, not because they didn't learn anything, but because they haven't been exposed to the rest. All right. There's a subset of children, particularly in that third group, a self-contained group who's learning a good amount of information, who are not put on that alternative assessment track, whether it's because of their diagnosis, not their diagnosis, but their initial testing scores, what they qualify for, or because their parents don't want them to be on the alternative assessment track, where they are going to end up taking the regular education assessments, especially at the higher grades, in order to receive or hopefully receive a diploma. But they haven't been taught at that level ever, because they were being taught at their own pace to mastery. I don't know. What do you guys think? I just threw a whole lot of information at you guys, but should special education students, how do you feel about the idea that there is a significant group of special education students out there who are learning, who are most definitely learning, and they're learning at a pretty good rate, who have to be assessed with accommodations, that's fine, on the general education curriculum at some point in the higher grades, knowing that they're never going to be exposed to some of these higher level skills? How do we reconcile those two? No, I do not have an answer. What do you guys think? Good.
The only thing I can think of is it just depends on the severity of the disability. You know, like, is it important for someone to be able to solve a certain formula or whatever if they just need really basic living skills, which obviously they wouldn't be in a general class, but like, I don't know.
Yeah.
That's the only thing I could think of.
And that's unfortunately a decision that's not always left up to the school. Fortunately or unfortunately, I don't know. Sometimes parents will make that decision and say, I want my child on regular ed assessment. I do not sign off on alternative assessment. Yeah.
Personally, it's complicated, but on some things I don't find it complicated. Like, if I had a choice between these higher level skills and understanding completely the English language, like getting them to understand how to read on their own and to develop reading skills, to speed up their reading and that kind of stuff, I would want to focus on those things because that's practical outside of these higher level skills that start to be developed into like higher grade levels and that kind of stuff.
Good. Okay. What if we don't get to define it by subject? What if we don't get to define it based on the utility of the skill? We're working with a parish that I won't out right now. Out's not the right word. I won't disclose. We've worked with them for a number of years and had a lot of success with a lot of students. And we've tracked, in some cases, the special education students that have worked in our SPED classes, and those students that have worked in other SPED classes, and those SPED students that have been in the general education environment. And our special education students have done years better than those other students, without question. But they're still not grade level. They're still not grade level. So now we're in a point where they're in 5th grade, they're in 6th grade. They're not on alternative assessment. And the district is coming to us saying, we've never taught them Louisiana history. And we're saying, no, but they can read. And they're saying, but they're going to be tested on Louisiana history. So, well, we could have taught them Louisiana history, but they still wouldn't know Louisiana history, and they wouldn't be able to read. There's this breaking point, right, where you focus on the skills you need to learn, to be able to learn the other concepts. Do you take one and totally throw out the other? Or do you expose them to all of it with the high probability they will not master either? That answer is easy to me. I would much rather a child who can read, that's never been exposed to Louisiana history, a child who's been exposed to reading, been exposed to Louisiana history, doesn't know what the hell Louisiana Purchase is, and still can't read, right? Like that's a no-brainer to me. But it's not that simple in the actual educational environment. When you look at the whole structure of the school district, of special education, how that interacts with the state, who the other stakeholders are, there's a lot going on there, for sure. But these are real problems that you will have to think about. What makes this even more complicated, in my idea, or my mind, is that everything that I just said here about special education applies to a subset of your general education population too. How do you work with, what do you do with the kids who are not SPED identified, who are years behind in your general education class, where you don't have those accommodations available to you? You don't have alternative curriculum or alternative assessments. They're really challenging questions that really, I don't know, it's easy to get up in front of a class and teach. It's hard to teach to everybody. That's kind of what, you know, I'll get off the soapbox. Any questions about that? I didn't, we'll spend a lot more time looking at specific skills-based assessments down the line so that you can see what it looks like to break up those skills into those really small parts. All right. Okay. Yeah, we'll keep going. All right. Curriculum-based assessment and curriculum-based measurements in SPED. So here, we're really focusing on again the group 2 and group 3, general education with support, special education, who's getting support, not on level, but moving along. So there's nothing inherently about curriculum-based assessment and curriculum-based measurement, as we spoke about them, that defines it as either special education or general education. There's no reason you can't use a global reading assessment for a special education student. There's no reason you couldn't give at its core, a Eureka math assessment, that CVA, to a special education student. There's nothing that says that inherently, all right? That being said, remember when I talked about the normal population and the Iowa test of basic skills and all that stuff? It is possible that in that norming population, they did not have an adequate number of special education students to say that this assessment is valid for the special education population. All right, so what do I mean by that? Let's say I give, I'm preparing to create this reading assessment, all right? So I give it to 10,000 students. I want to see where they all fall. I get the range and I'm able to make some decisions based off of that. But in that 10,000 students, those 10,000 students, I only have 5 special education students. So I only have 5 individual data points for special education students. I'm not going to be able to have an idea, a good idea of how special education students take this test. And therefore, I can't say that my test is valid for special education students. Following a little bit? Kind of? Okay. So let's say it another way. In a typical population of 10,000 students, you should have 500, 1,000 special education students. If you only have 5, then you don't have a representation of your special education population. So I don't know how they would typically respond. All right. What do? I then take that same assessment. If I am a curriculum maker, if I'm an assessment maker, I take that same assessment and I specifically solicit special education students to take this assessment. And I find 1,000, 5,000, 10,000 students. I give it to them. And now I can say, we have found that we get the same results for special education as we do for general education. Therefore, it's valid for special education students. All right. So it's possible that while there's nothing that says they can't take the assessment, what we may not be able to say is whether the results are interpretable for special education students. All right. So when we are giving these assessments, we need to make sure that the results are going to be meaningful for us, for our special education students. Most of the time, again, this is out of your hands as a teacher. This is in your curriculum instructor's hands or director of curriculum in the district. It's on them to select curricula that have been validated for special education students and the assessments that go along with that. All right. But if you don't have that, let's say you know that to be the case, then you need to advocate for yourself to find, for that person to find special education assessments that have been validated for special education. They are out there, do exist. Okay. So what we're really, really looking for is this insurance that the result that I get is meaningful for a special education, or just as meaningful for a special education student as it is for a regular education student. All right, make sense? Other than that, there's nothing much to say about CBAs and CBMs as they relate to special education students. There's going to be this process that you have to follow. There's going to be a curriculum that it's tied to. That can be a special education curriculum. That can be a general education curriculum. That can be whatever concept you're looking at. A reading assessment is a reading assessment, period. It's just whether or not that reading assessment is valid for special education students. Sound good? All right, cool. And finally, we have formal versus informal assessments. So when we spoke about standardized tests last week, the biggest pro for standardized tests, for those formal assessments, is that we know that they are valid and reliable. We know that these test makers have spent millions of dollars making sure that what these tests say they are measuring are what they're actually measuring, and that they are not going to be biased in any way, shape, or form to any one group or another, right? You might be laughing at that a little bit. We all know that these standardized tests do get very biased over time, but it drifts that way. They don't start out that way, all right? So with formal assessments, that can still exist, just as I was saying for CBAs and CBMs. that can still exist in the special education environment. You can have a formal assessment with those standardized procedures that is just as high quality for special education students. You can have formal assessments that are developed specifically for special education students. Those are going to look very, very different. What you're looking for, though, is are the changes, are the differences between the formal assessment for the general education population, the formal assessment for the SPED population, are those changes overcompensating for our students with disabilities? Do the testing procedures provide too much support such that the outcome is no longer meaningful? There is one particular curriculum. It comes with its own assessments. So it's a curriculum-based assessment called unique learning. Have anyone heard of that before? A little bit? Not so much? Okay. It's the predominant special education curriculum in schools today. The assessment procedure outlines the different levels of support that you are going to go through during an assessment. So you're going to ask the student the question. If they don't respond, then you are going to ask it with this level of assistance. If they don't respond, then you're going to ask it with this other level of assistance, so on and so forth. All the way down to if you ask the question and you, for all intents and purposes, respond for them. Whether that's by lifting their hand and selecting the response, whether that is telling them response and hopefully having them repeat it, but in some way, you are providing this very invasive prompt. Now, those prompts have a place in special education. I'm not trying to say that, but I cannot then go and say, my child has learned the skill. But the curriculum says, if they can do it, even with that level of prompt, you get a check. So that is a big problem for me in terms of the validity of that assessment. If they say, if the assessment says they can do the skill, I expect them to be able to do the skill with some level of independence. Some being key there, right? When you get to a point where there is no independence, that's not doing the skill. It's not knowing the skill, that's not being able to participate in the skill. So in my mind, that CBA accommodates too far. All right. The converse are those that don't, those formal assessments that don't make any accommodation. You have to read exactly as it is. Those are not valid for special education. Two sides of the coin. All right. The good, before I go on to the next slide, the good formal assessments allow for this push and pull. Allow for different levels of responding, different levels of knowledge, but never go to the point. But there is, at the end of the day, there is a black and white. There is a you either know the skill or you do not. There's one assessment, curriculum and assessment that we use that differentiates by what we call levels of reinforcement. So can you do it when I ask you the skill? Can you do it if I offer you a token to trade in for something else if you get it right? Can you do it if I give you a cookie or a gummy bear if you get it right? All right. All three require you to respond independently. But you have many special education students who will do it for the gummy, but not for praise. It's very, very different than you didn't do it, and I picked up your hand and I went like that, and now I check it out. Okay, so again, we'll get into that later. All right, so by contrast with informal SPED assessment, so remember when we get to informal assessment, we're not talking about like the everything else. Informal assessments, we are given a lot of freedom. We have, just as we are with our general education informal assessments, we can ask questions, we can do activities, we can see how our students are interacting with each other. There are all these different ways of providing, of conducting informal assessment. Exact same thing in special education. But the problem is now we're talking about a population that's already challenging to assess, already challenging to have these structures in place. And now we're taking out all forms of validity. So how do we know that the answer that I just got, the behavior that I just looked at, is any sort of meaning? Informal assessment within special education is very challenging. And many of the high quality special education assessment or curricula that are out there have assessment embedded in them. So that you are conducting kind of, to some degree, formative and summative assessment consistently or constantly. We'll take a look at what that means later in a couple of weeks. All right. All right, so to summarize, special education assessment can exist in two primary forms. We have accommodations and we have alternative assessment. Within the accommodation strand and within the alternative assessment strand, we can have assessment at all 6 of those levels that we looked at before. So we can have formal and informal, we can have CVAs and CVMs, we can have formative and summative. The challenge, the biggest challenge, is making sure that the information that we get, just like with our gen ed assessment, is meaningful to decision making. The added layer there is we have to take into account what is happening as a result of the disability, what is being prevented by the assessment, what is being, and what gives us the best picture overall. All right, cool. Any questions? Sounds good. Assignments due on Thursday. I'll see you guys in class on Thursday. Have a good one.